When Jane Jacobs' classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was published in 1961, it created a lot of controversy. William H. White called it one of the most remarkable books ever written about the city. Most professional urban renewal experts found Jane Jacobs' conclusions about what makes a city vital, safe, and culturally exciting hard to believe, but in the decade following the publication of her book, it gradually became clear she was right. Then, in 1969, she published The Economy of Cities. This was shortly after she had moved from New York to Toronto, where she now lives as a Canadian citizen. With this second book, Jane Jacobs' place among important contemporary social theorists was assured. Here's Jane Jacobs with the fifth of the 1979 Massey Lectures.
Last week I discussed the associations a sovereign Quebec might have with the rest of Canada. This week I plan to comment on the sovereignty part of sovereignty association. Quebec is the only province for which independence is realistically possible in the foreseeable future. The chief reason for that is equalization. Under our equalization policy, federal tax yields from all the provinces, rich and poor, are pooled and then redistributed. They help pay for public services and social programs the poor provinces couldn't maintain on their own. In addition, Ottawa tries to help out the poor provinces with special, and usually very expensive, development schemes. In theory, equalization isn't charity. It's been intended to improve the economies of the poor provinces, help them become more self-supporting. But it hasn't really worked out that way. The poor provinces remain poor. Nevertheless, the funds distributed from Ottawa do make poverty easier to bear, and do help disguise the economic stagnation in the poor provinces. The poorest are the Atlantic provinces, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba are also on the receiving side of the ledger. In any conference among provincial premiers, those from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland can usually be depended on to support strengthened central government. Quite apart from the emotional attachments of these provinces to Confederation, strong federalism is their bread and butter. Ontario and Alberta are, of course, the two richest provinces, but British Columbia is also on the giving side of the ledger. In any conference of premiers, the three from these provinces can usually be depended on to press for greater provincial autonomy, more leeway to run their own affairs and make their own decisions, meaning looser federalism. Neither the have-not provinces nor the haves are in a position to think seriously about independence. The have-nots are too dependent on the federal government. The federal government is too dependent on the haves. Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia are thus somewhat in the position of family breadwinners who've taken on heavy responsibilities for their dependents. They may complain about the burdens, they may grumble and insist on having their own way sometimes. But morally and practically they can't walk out on their dependents. The dependents, for their part, may grumble and envy, may even accuse their benefactors of having trapped them into economic dependency. They often accuse Ontario of having done just that. But the dependents can't walk out either. What would they live on? The bookkeeping of equalization is so complex and confused it's literally beyond understanding. And in addition to equalization payments, the federal government distributes many other funds and services. Nobody, whether in Ottawa or in the provinces, knows exactly what the balance sheets are, exactly what the difference is between tax revenues sent from any given province to Ottawa and the revenues and services received back. Even so, the discrepancies between what's yielded and what's received are great enough in 9 cases, so there's no doubt about their financial roles in Confederation. 3 breadwinners, 6 dependents. Quebec, the 10th case is different. The Québécois claim they yield up more revenue to Ottawa than they get back, and they can make out a plausible-sounding case to support that claim. Ottawa, on the other hand, says Quebec gets more than it yields, and can make out a plausible-sounding case to support that claim, too. The very fact that they can both argue this way shows how close the balance sheet must be. Walter Gordon has said that 10 years ago, when he was federal finance minister, Quebec had roughly a quarter of the population, yielded just about a quarter of federal revenues, and probably got back just about a quarter. Things may have changed somewhat since, one way or the other. Nobody knows. The point is, whatever may be the exact truth concealed beneath the impenetrable bookkeeping, Quebec is clearly singular. It's the only province that could become independent without forcing serious financial sacrifices on either the other provinces or itself. Sovereignty is many-sided. Its various aspects overlap and interlock. But keeping that in mind, we can think of René Lévesque's sovereignty proposals under 3 headings: cultural, economic, and political. Cultural sovereignty revolves around language. That's to be expected, because language is at the heart of any people's culture. What Lévesque wants culturally for Quebec is sovereignty over powers concerned with communication, immigration, and language. He defines communications as television and radio broadcasting. This seems to mean he wants a Quebec broadcasting company independent from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. When he speaks of language head-on, he regrets that, as he puts it, a fortress of laws protects the rights of Québécois to use their own language. He says one of the reasons he has dreamed of political sovereignty is, and I quote, "precisely so that we will not have to legislate on questions which should be as clear as the air we breathe." In matters concerned with language, he wants Quebec to have, as he puts it, whatever is normal to a national community which administers its own affairs. As to whether this is a good or bad cultural aim, I, for one, can't help but think it's good. While I've been preparing this talk, I've been entertaining myself after work by reading the translation of a charming Japanese novel written in 1913 about the Japan of the 1880s, and a novel about the pageant of English history by Virginia Woolf. I love living these multiple lives. It's possible only because many different cultures have become wonderfully articulate, enriching us all. For the culture of French Quebec to languish rather than flourish on its own terms would mean some impoverishment for us all. But those sentiments don't tell us why Lévesque and many other Québécois have now become so aggressive about the elbow room their culture needs. The most thoughtful comments I've come across are those of David Cameron, an economist and political scientist at Trent University. He points out that before the quiet revolution of the 1960s, French Quebec's culture had managed to preserve itself behind a shell of isolation and unchanging tradition. It did little more than survive, but it did find the security to do that. Now, he points out, there is no security for the culture in resistance to change. Too much else has changed. The only possible way to ensure its own future is for Quebec's culture to initiate changes and ride with them. It has to develop or die. Cameron and the authors he quotes have some interesting things to say about changing views concerning uniformity and diversity. I'm going to comment on this point because it has a bearing not only on cultural sovereignty, but on economic sovereignty too. A few moments ago, I remarked that every different articulate culture enriches us all. That's such a cliché, we might suppose it's always been self-evident. Not so. It expresses a rather recent point of view. During what we call the Enlightenment, the European intellectual climate that dominated the 18th century and prevailed well into Victorian times, and in many ways into our own, people took a view of nature which has since been turned upside down. The Enlightenment view was that nature itself seeks standardization, uniformity, universality, immutability. Spinoza, a forerunner of the Enlightenment, put it in so many words. He said, "The purpose of nature is to make men uniform as children of a common mother." People always seem to want to believe they're in harmony with the world as it's ordered by nature or the gods that be. Perhaps such a belief is necessary to human morale. At any rate, the concept of a natural order seems to wriggle into our thought about all kinds of things, and so it was with the thought of the Enlightenment. Universality and uniformity as ideals subtly influenced thought about education, politics, economics, government, everything. In the meantime, naturalists went on studying nature. What they found made it impossible to continue thinking of nature as a force promoting uniformity. On the contrary, what they learned revealed nature as a force which is forever wiping away uniformity and casting up diversity. Today, we think of standardization and immutability too as being unnatural. That idea has not yet been assimilated into all the nooks and crannies of our thoughts, let alone our actions. We still find many cultural lags. But the belief that diversity is both natural and wholesome has come to influence thought and action in 1,000 everyday ways. And we may be as sure as we can be sure of anything that this is so, as long as our current understanding of nature's nature prevails. The belief that diversity itself is excellent will continue to be a powerful and growing influence on thought about all kinds of things. At the time the underlying cultural rules for Canada were laid down, the ideal of uniformity and universality was still operating full force. As a heritage, it has left us with a deep uneasiness about the separateness of English and French Canada, and a feeling that our inability to dissolve the differentness has been some sort of social or political failure. That idea has been dinned into us by novelists, politicians, and especially by English-speaking Canada's historians. But looked at in the light of changing and changed ideas about uniformity on the one hand and diversity on the other, the sense that we should dissolve the differentness of English and French Canada is antiquated. Looked at in that light, official bilingualism is an instance of cultural lag, a sort of last gasp of the Enlightenment ideal. We force English-speaking civil servants with no gift for languages to qualify in French, and we legislate the bags of macaroni and the announcements of postal rate increases into saying everything in both French and English, even where Italian and English, or Ukrainian and English, or Chinese and English, or Italian and French might be more to the point. If we've failed at uniformity, well then, the bilingual policy tells us, we can at least still try for the standardization of universality. But once we've come to feel in our bones that diversity is valid, then the vision of an artificially and uniformly bilingual Canada simply becomes arbitrary and silly. Then the separateness and differentness of English and French Canada no longer seems cause for uneasiness and regret on anyone's part. On the contrary, the whole stubborn tale comes to seem a triumph for the splendid principles of life itself. Lo and behold, here in our midst is differentness that simply wouldn't be squelched. An important practical virtue of diversity is this. Many truly independent institutions, even those with similar purposes, are bound to use different ways of going at things. They're bound to develop different aims from one another, too. Under uniform control or centralized control, experiment comes hard, and eventually improvements come not at all. The chance of hitting on fresh ideas and fresh methods is thus the chief value of the Levesque proposals for economic sovereignty. Or at any rate, that's the chief value of them for the rest of us in other parts of Canada. Almost all Levesque's proposals for economic sovereignty concern investment, ownership, and control. He wants Quebec's savings and other capital to be invested in Quebec's own development. He'd thus apply to Quebec much the same rule for control of banks that's now applied by Ottawa to Canadian banks. That is, he'd like to allow non-residents of Quebec to hold no more than 25% of the voting shares of a bank operating in Quebec. Similarly, Canadian law now requires Canadian insurance companies to reinvest fixed proportions of their incomes in Canada. Levesque would leave the ratios undisturbed, but the insurance companies operating in Quebec would have to reinvest in Quebec. By these means, he'd attempt to stem what he calls the hemorrhaging of Quebec capital. His name for this policy is repatriation of the Quebec economy. Behind that idea are many specific worries. He talks about Quebec's huge borrowings from outside the province and the country, and the huge costs of servicing those debts. The interest payments drain money away. He worries that so many Quebec industries and resources are owned and controlled from outside. He also worries over Canadian agricultural policies, about which he has this to say. I quote, "The federal minister of agriculture very often follows policies which to us are undesirable and which sabotage the Quebec agricultural markets. This is the case very frequently in the milk industry, which is traditionally the backbone of Quebec agricultural production and which feels itself literally strangled." End of the quote. As a consumer of Ontario's excellent and varied cheddar cheeses, I worry about the Milk Board too. Its policies, the press informs us, are destroying all but the largest Ontario cheese producers. I won't be happy with nothing but Kraft and Borden Ontario cheeses. Many people in other parts of Canada are, of course, worried about some of the same things that worry Levesque. They worry that Canada has become perhaps the largest borrower of foreign funds in the Western world, that almost half of Canadian manufacturing capacity is owned by U.S. companies, that Canada lacks venture capital, or else does not know how to use it, that Canada's share of manufactured goods in world trade keeps dropping. Levesque's proposals for economic sovereignty are not concerned with concrete questions or issues of how economies develop. When I spoke about Norway's trade in my second talk, I commented that Norway takes a creative approach to development, and that Canada, with its fixation on the exploitation and export of resources and the attraction of branch plants, does not. Levesque seems to take for granted the traditional Canadian idea that wealth is based on natural resources, not on the inventiveness of people. His notions about development seem to be essentially the same as Ottawa's. Nor am I impressed by the Lévesque government's pronouncements on scientific and technological research. They sound just like every other bureaucracy's pompous nonsense on that subject. In that case, we may well ask, what is the point of having two economic sovereignties where there was one before? Is there any value in this possibility, at least for those of us outside Quebec? There is practical value. In the first place, Quebec's repatriation of banking and capital actually could amount to significant change in Quebec. And in economic life, when any one thing changes, other things start to change too. In the second place, just the fact of different people being in charge in the two different sovereignties and having two different constituencies would increase the chances for fresh judgments and fresh approaches. And finally, the fact that Quebec really does have a different culture means an increased chance things might be done differently there. At worst, we'd learn nothing useful from Quebec's experience with economic sovereignty. At best, we might learn a good deal. The Milk Board might learn something. Now we come to political sovereignty. With one exception, Lévesque's proposals on this subject are easily stated. He would like the Quebec National Assembly, which is the provincial parliament, to be a national parliament with all the usual powers over taxes and laws that national parliaments have. He'd like Quebec to have a seat in the United Nations and probably membership in the Commonwealth. He'd like Quebec to take its place as a nation on appropriate international commissions and to cooperate with Canada as an equal on joint scientific projects or other joint ventures of mutual interest. All that is straightforward and simple and normal enough, at least in concept. But whenever Lévesque touches on the subject of a political structure to handle customs union and a common currency, his proposals become tortured. His usual lucidity turns muddy and his usual eloquence flounders. On the one hand, he expresses fears that direction of Quebec's affairs might revert back to Ottawa. And as a general principle, he fears that associated sovereignties face the danger of falling into what he calls merely a multinational, multicultural federalism. On the other hand, when he attempts to describe joint management of the currency and matters affecting the currency, he conjures up exactly the sort of centralized power structure that would make his fears come true. He proposes joint Canadian-Quebec bodies at what he calls the technocratic level, and centralized special ministries, and possibly also, in his words, a delegated parliament to which both sides would delegate members who are already elected to their parliaments, and which would meet once or twice a year. And then he adds, and here I quote, "It could go further if necessary, but on one condition, that, when the time comes, sovereignty in all its defined dimensions is neither affected nor restricted by exterior structures." Indeed. Then why have all those exterior structures? The Quebec government's white paper conjures up an even more elaborate superstructure. A joint council of ministers for the two countries, Canada and Quebec, plus a commission of experts to act as a general secretariat for both countries, plus a monetary authority to coordinate some of the policies and actions of the two countries' central banks, plus a court of justice to interpret the treaties setting all this up and to keep both countries in line. The court's decisions would be final and binding on both Canada and Quebec. If Canada would like to have, besides all this, a super interparliamentary assembly for the two countries, Quebec would be willing to consider it a matter for negotiation. Last week, I explained why two of Lévesque's aspirations for Quebec, sovereignty and a shared currency with Canada, are not reconcilable. Here we see the contradiction rearing its head again. The elaborate super-government would leave Quebec with only a pretense of economic and political sovereignty. It would be a fancy way to construct a multinational, multicultural federalism, to use Lévesque's own description of what should be avoided. And it would saddle us all with additional layers of bureaucracy and with a new layer of central government and centralized control even more remote from us than what we have now. This would be a high price to pay for what I can only understand as Quebec's timidity about a currency of its own. In sum, then, looking at sovereignty association as a whole, Lévesque's concept seems to offer much that would be advantageous to both the rest of Canada and Quebec. But because of the illogical and unworkable proposal for a shared currency, the concept is flawed, and the flaw is so serious that it would undercut all the potential advantages of sovereignty association for Canada and most of the advantages for Quebec. Does this mean, then, that sovereignty association should be dismissed out of hand? No, not at all. Here I'll offer a fable, which happens to be true. Some years ago, the Ontario government joined with a West German corporation to develop a new form of transit, quiet, very rapid, and efficient in its requirements for energy and space. Electromagnets were used to move the vehicles without friction on a cushion of air above a narrow, elevated track. Unfortunately, the thing wouldn't work on curves. After some $25 million had been spent, Ontario and its German partner dropped the project. Who wanted a train that can't turn corners? The Japanese did. Japan Airlines took up the idea and spun off a new organization to work on it, under the premise that even if the track had to be straight, there were plenty of good uses for such a fine system. This was reported in the Toronto press, along with the comments of an Ontario transportation expert who had visited the first Japanese test track. He said it was so straight it's almost unbelievable, and that the absence of curves simplified the project enough to enable the Japanese to get going. Soon afterward, further word reached Toronto from the head of the Japanese project's engineering group. He reported that they had finally found a way, after all, to overcome the trouble at the curves. Test vehicles in Japan are now running successfully on 2 curvilinear sections of track. The moral of the fable, of course, is that you don't start with what you cannot do. You start with what you can do, if the doing has worthwhile advantages. Then, if you can, you evolve improvements on that foundation. This is the common-sense approach to all creative endeavors of any difficulty. Indeed, it amounts to virtually a law of development, whether we're thinking of the way things are successfully developed by human beings or of the way development happens in nature. René Lévesque's concept has a flaw. It doesn't turn corners, but it can do other useful and worthwhile things. There is much to be said for it, both from Quebec's viewpoint and from the rest of Canada's. In any case, independence or sovereignty for Quebec would have to be introduced in stages and steps. By the time it became necessary for Quebec to confront the need for its own currency, it would likely have built up the necessary self-confidence, and a way of introducing the change could be worked out, either by means of the 2-stage process I suggested last week or some other device. The problem is not nearly as difficult, technically, as putting those curves in the track, nor is the introduction of a new currency for a new sovereignty an unprecedented sort of problem. It has often been done successfully. One of the hangovers of the Enlightenment is the notion that immutability is natural. Of course it isn't. Everything changes. No governmental arrangements last forever. The best we can hope for is that changes be constructive and flexible. We might think of sovereignty association as an experiment rather than a solution for all time. All of us, if we're reasonably comfortable, healthy, and safe, owe immense debts to the past. There's no way, of course, to repay the past. We can only pay those debts by making gifts to the future. We're all worried, I think, about our bequest to the future, worried that we may be presenting the generations to come chiefly with heavy burdens and terrible unsolved problems rather than new gifts. Among the burdens we've contrived are the stifling, wasteful, and all but uncontrollable centralized bureaucracies that have proliferated so wildly and rapidly in our time, even in Canada. What a mess! What a load for the next generations to bear. Perhaps right now, and right here, we can do a little something to lighten that burden. If we were to work out a kind of sovereignty for Quebec and a kind of association that really does combat centralization instead of increasing it, that would be a presentable gift to the future. Nobody has quite done what we would have to do. Sort out and keep only the connections Quebec and the rest of Canada would need to trade with each other and cooperate on projects of mutual interest, and discard the connections that would require Quebec and the rest of Canada to try to run each other's governments as well as their own. If we could do that, we could say what people say of the gifts they're proudest to give. We made it ourselves.
Canadian Cities and Sovereignty Association by Jane Jacobs. You've heard the fifth and concluding talk in this series of 1979 CBC Massey Lectures. Editorial Assistant Diane Rothstein. Production Assistant Susan Cramond. Producer Max Allen.